Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing amazing. We have the other great game continuation here for Old Britannia. This is Britain versus the United States, 1846 to 1914. So it looks like we're going to be covering like 70 years in this episode. Um, as we left off, we saw the end of the War of 1812 culminate into some border disputes, as well as the continuation of like the Northwest Territory, otherwise known as like the Oregon Territory, kind of being like a dual like no man's land, as well as Texas was joined the United States, and we had some continuation of like slave traders and some debacles in the Caribbean, and then of course the Monroe Doctrine in South America, and so much other stuff. So go watch the other video if you haven't already, or if this is a confirmation, you're just here. So let's keep watching.
Oregon. Despite the settling of the Oregon dispute in 1848, Polk continued to re-energize the Monroe Doctrine into one of action. The subsequent continued American expansion strained relations in the 1840s, and with threats of annexing Hawaii, politicians like Aberdeen began to wonder if the United States' territorial appetite would ever abate.
Not until the 1900s.
Central America was the next area of conflict, as both nations sought to extract favourable economic concessions. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty was, after much wrangling, concluded between Britain and the US, which stipulated neither will exercise any dominion over any part of Central America. But as so many times before, it meant little in an atmosphere poisoned by suspicion. The tensions continued. In 1852, Spain tried to persuade France, the United States and Britain to join a self-denying ordinance with respect to Cuba. Only the United States refused, and the Secretary of State, Everett, boldly asserted that the manifest destiny of his country would involve the acquisition of all European territories in the Americas. In
Jeez.
1852, Pierce, an expansionist, was elected president. It was obvious the struggle.
So Pierce was an expansionist. I don't really know too much about a lot of the 1800 prior to Lincoln, in terms of presidents. That's something that will eventually declassify over time.
Struggle in Central America was far from over. In February 1853, Russell brusquely rejected Everett's thesis, and in the following year, Clarendon assailed the Monroe Doctrine itself. Her Majesty's government cannot admit that doctrine as an international axiom which ought to regulate the conduct of European states.
So they basically outright rejecting the Monroe Doctrine as legislation of matters that will pertain to the European countries.
Gradually, the two powers drifted towards war once again. In 1856, an American adventurer, William Walker, seized Greytown on the Mosquito Coast. Palmerston pressed for the fleet to be sent and for the chastisement of Nicaragua, which was supporting Walker. Calmer voices prevailed in cabinet, supported by Disraeli and the Commons. For the first time since Canning, there was a genuine attempt to review the basis of British policy towards the United States. As Disraeli observed, if England is to regard every expansion of the United States as an act detrimental to her interests and hostile to her power, we shall be pursuing a course which will involve this country in struggles that may prove of a disastrous character. Britain began recognising that in areas her interests were not significantly at stake, competing with the United States could only be to her detriment. Thus, between 1859 and 1860, a series of treaties were negotiated between Britain and the republics of Central America, surrendering many of the British claims and bringing to an end conflict in this era.
But there's still like I don't know what part of Central America that is. If that's Belize or whatnot. I'm sorry, I'm not that geographically inclined when it comes to Central America, but right below the Yucatan, where there's definitely some red associating itself with Britain. What is that?
Part of the reason for Britain's retreat in these areas was the changing economic relationship between the two. The United States had started the century dependent on imports from British industry. By the 1850s, this was clearly no longer the case, as the United States' own industrialisation began in earnest. US industries were, by the end of the century, beginning to outpace their British counterparts.
So, coal production and steel production, 1880 to 1900. Look at that. It just triples, quadruples. And then Britain sustains. Obviously, you're going to have less resources in that on that aisle. Steel production is pretty crazy too. 10x is it, and then 30x is it. Like it's just not even close.
They were helped by Britain's dogmatic commitment to free trade, which allowed the dumping of American products in the imperial market. The United States, by contrast, was highly protectionist, particularly after the 1857 tariff,
Yeah, let's say tariffs have to be a thing.
created by James Buchanan, was replaced with the Morrill Tariff of 1861.
Oh, so Lincoln's in office.
This protected US industries from British competition, but was in reality far too high and helped give the country its infamous robber barons. Britain should have retaliated, especially once the immense agricultural potential of the United States was opened up in the 1870s that would go on to swamp Britain's domestic sector. But the dogma of free trade was too strong, and so the imperial market was increasingly encroached upon by the US. Nonetheless, by 1860, Anglo-American relations were then on a much better footing, but the establishment of the Confederacy in 1861 would bring a new period of difficulty.
Yeah, you're gonna have difficulties on trade, you're gonna blockades, you're gonna have assertion of, I mean, one thing that's interesting here is like the damnation of slavery is like the crutch of a possible allied confederacy to many places like Britain or Spain and other places. So it's such an interesting like juxtaposition between United States and the Confederacy within the likes of the European powers, and who is to support who and what to be neutral with and what to not be neutral with.
Palmerston could barely conceal his hope that the United States would disintegrate.
Yeah.
On the whole, however, British opinion was divided over the Civil War. There was sympathy for the Confederacy among certain trading groups, the aristocracy, and those who disliked Yankee arrogance. Anti-slaving groups and radicals tended to prefer the Union. The American Civil War itself dealt a great deal of injury to British commerce, as the Union imposed a blockade upon Confederate ports.
Yeah, that's the Anaconda Plan.
Thus seriously damaging the important cotton trade with Britain. Union supporters in Britain were further undermined by the internal politics of the North, which initially restricted Lincoln from taking an unambiguous line on the issue of slavery, thus confusing many as to what the actual point of the war was. Palmerston, though a man who took extreme joy in making slavers' lives miserable, saw in the Civil War a chance to weaken the US. He was greatly assisted in this effort by Seward, the Secretary of State. His conduct in 1861 verged on the insane. In order to comply with international law, the European trading nations had to recognise the Confederacy as a belligerent power. This did not mean a recognition of sovereignty. At a time when the US was poised on the brink of internal conflict, Seward proposed on the 1st of April 1861 that Spain, Britain, Russia and France be asked for precise explanations for their conduct, failing which war was to be declared.
What?
This was utter lunacy, and Lincoln unsurprisingly ignored the document, but Seward's hostile attitude to Britain in particular was well known. Britain received envoys from the Confederacy during the conflict, though no promise to recognise the state was ever given.
Yeah.
Seward,
mainly because of the slavery issue, and then also a war that they did not want to even mess with,
told Adams, the American ambassador to London, to threaten war if Britain had any communication with the so-called commissioners, the domestic enemies of the United States.
No way.
Adams wisely disregarded this nonsense, but was unable to stop the threat becoming public knowledge. On the whole, most American policymakers were well aware of the dangers this type of recklessness could lead to, especially after troops were dispatched to Canada by Britain in June 1861.
I didn't know that.
And the British cabinet on the whole was committed to neutrality. In August 1861 it resolved not to recognise the Confederacy. There was some pressure for Britain to arrange a mediation with France, but it became increasingly apparent that any such intervention would be tantamount to supporting the Confederacy. The greatest threat to the policy of neutrality came from Union actions against British ships. In the past, there had been American support for the rights of neutrals and British claims for belligerents. During the Civil War, these roles were reversed. In November 1861, the Trent affair erupted when a Union sloop stopped a British steamer and took off 2 Confederate diplomats bound for London. This was a serious error of judgment, for not only was the Confederate mission doomed to failure, this was the only conceivable issue that could bring Britain into the conflict. Palmerston issued a demand for the diplomat's return, which he believed would lead to war. But Seward, in a remarkable volte-face, convinced Lincoln's cabinet to give way. The Trent debacle was the most serious, though not the only, diplomatic breach between the two powers. Others included an argument over the Alabama, a privateer built
The USS Alabama? That's cool. I live in Alabama.
in England that was widely known to be being constructed for the Confederacy.
That's crazy. I didn't know that.
Russell failed to block the ship's departure, which Palmerston subsequently admitted was a mistake. With the war's end, the United States demanded compensation for the loss in shipping that had resulted from the Alabama's raiding. Claims such as this weren't settled until the Treaty of Washington in 1871, by which Britain agreed to pay $15.5 million in compensation, in return for about half of that from the United States to cover damage done to Canadian trade in the war. Overall, however, the threat of Britain ever intervening in the Civil War was always remote. There were nonetheless attempts to take advantage of America's inability to uphold Polk's aggressive version of the Monroe Doctrine. In May 1861, Spain reasserted control over Santo Domingo, though her authority collapsed within 4 years.
Well, that didn't work.
A more serious threat to US interests occurred with a Franco-Spanish invasion of Mexico in 1862, over
Yeah, Maximilian, brother of what's his name? It's escaping me. Is it Franz Joseph? The Austrian emperor. Brother of the Austrian emperor becomes the emperor for a couple of years down here in Mexico.
for a moratorium on debt repayment. Palmerston originally had wanted to act in concert with these powers, but after a separate agreement with the Mexicans, decided he wanted no part in Napoleon III's plans for regime change. Britain subsequently pressured Spain to withdraw her contingent. France was not to be so easily dissuaded, and it was not until the death of Maximilian of Austria in 1867 her involvement ceased. The Mexican affair strengthened Anglo-American relations as it confirmed the trend begun in Central America of Britain slowly detaching itself from the United States' sphere of influence. With the end of the Civil War in the Union's favour and the exponential economic growth that followed, it became
Exponential.
increasingly apparent that Britain could not maintain its position as both a rival of the United States in the Americas and the European powers on the continent.
Yeah, because you got like a interesting France, because this is pre-Franco-Prussian War. This is an expansive Germany that's seeking unification. This is a Austria that's seeking to hold on to their Habsburg powers that have been diminished, especially like in the Italian front, the Italian unification on the rise. This is with a Russia that is just ever so a wild card, and the Poland that, well, that's not even Poland, that's Russia that we see in frame there with a red that's asserted itself as Poland. But you have just a concert of Europe that is just going in and out of tune, I would say. So like you could be you're not the 1750 Great Britain anymore. You are the United Kingdom, and you are a country that needs to handle its affairs at home, because the balance of power in Europe is just so damning at this point.
Britain subsequently came to finally regard the US as a great power, and thus began altering her policy accordingly.
So it took until the Civil War to end before that occurred. And then obviously after that, the steel and coal production just goes through the roof.
Avoiding clashes she may previously have taken up, but it was to be a long time until friendship became the basis of relations. Under Gladstone and Disraeli's ministries in the 1870s and 80s, the trend of recognising America as a great power continued. This did not, however, mean an end to disputes between the two. As the US grew in strength, it became more prepared to display it in the Americas. Britain tended to try and avoid friction on a case-by-case basis, without a significant reorientation in
The Isthmus Canal dispute. Ooh. That's Panama.
strategy. As usual, it fell to Salisbury to actually undertake a long overdue change in British policy. As a dyed-in-the-wool illiberal Tory, he had his class's instinctive fear of the United States, but he also understood that Britain could no longer put off the need to once and for all deal with the lasting areas of friction between the two countries. The spark for this change came in 1895 when the US Secretary of State, Olney, turned an old boundary dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana into a brash reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine. Salisbury originally tried to stall, presumably in the hope the Americans would get bored, but was overruled by the cabinet, which feared escalation at a time of heightened tensions with Europe. "We expect the French to hate us," Selbon declared, "but the Americans, no." Consequently, Britain.
So they got to preserve that relationship, mainly probably due to the economic relationship they've had, given the expansionness of the industrialization of America. I imagine that's got to be the forefront priority, past the anglicized relationship they have occurred over the last 120 years.
Agreed to US arbitration, a concession which Washington repaid with a settlement favourable to Britain in the dispute. London had, in effect, tacitly accepted the Monroe Doctrine meant American hegemony in the hemisphere. Salisbury and his successor at the Foreign Office, Lansdowne, then moved to eliminate all remaining sources of tension, relinquishing British claims to Panama, where the US intended to build a canal, on Alaska's boundary, where Canadian interests were sacrificed, and in the Spanish-American War of 1898, where Britain, as the only European power not openly hostile to the United States, wrecked German attempts to form an anti-American bloc.
Wow, which meant an economic bloc.
And subsequently supported US control of the Philippines over Germany's claim. The Spanish-American War in many ways marked the penultimate evolution of the Anglo-American relationship. Almost overnight, the United States had carved out for itself a seat at the world table.
Yeah, like look at that. So you got like the Philippines, you got Guam, you got Hawaii, you got Puerto Rico, you got Cuba basically. So you have like 1898, like this is under McKinley. You're going to have a crazy imperialistic view the world here, and then obviously you got Mr. Roosevelt as your VP here. It's just gonna it's gonna calm down over the next 30-40 years, but this is like the height of American imperialism in terms of conquest and land seizures from war and so forth.
And showed itself to be an imperial power, capable of projecting strength globally.
Yeah.
It was, however,
thanks to the United States Navy, really, because a lot of these are islands, so you're going to need a combination of naval supremacy as well as like a marine unit embarkment that can overtake the power, but you're also going to need a treasury that can build off this. So it's kind of like, if you look at the past 120 years, you're going to literally see a playbook that has been stolen from the UK. Really, that's what happened. But it's also been Americanized a little bit.
Testament to how successful the change in attitudes in both countries had been, that this newfound imperial status did not herald a new era of rivalry. On the contrary, in the opening decade of the 20th century, the presidency of Roosevelt showed it was now possible to combine the previously mutually exclusive beliefs of American expansionism and a somewhat pro-British stance. Roosevelt found a use for his country's rapidly growing economic strength in the creation of a large battle fleet. It was again a testament to the increasingly warm relations that, though Britain was nervous about the expansion, it provoked nothing like the reaction Germany's naval program did. It was again a testament to the increasingly warm relations that, though Britain was nervous about the expansion.
This is 1909, so you obviously got Germany there. I'm not sure who these two big guys on the left are. I assume one's got to be Britain. One's probably France. Really don't know. But then you got Japan, right? That's I can see the flag. He's holding the boat. So this is after this obviously expansion. You have an imperial nation in the east with Japan in 1909. Interesting.
It provoked nothing like the reaction Germany's naval.
Wait, it says at the bottom, Japan, I see your cruisers and I raise you a dreadnought. I wonder if one of these are Russia then, in that case. Because you got the German flag there. That's crazy.
Program did. In large part, this was because Roosevelt and Taft's expansionism was never truly embraced by the American public, and after 1908 their ambitions were reined in by a skeptical Congress. There was also the basic strategic fact that US sea power was hobbled by the need to defend two oceans, and if a war with the United States had become unpalatable to London, it was no more thinkable in Washington. British naval supremacy was, declared Roosevelt, the great guarantee for the peace of the world. For him, the purpose of the US Navy was not to compete with Britain, but to be a junior member of an informal two-power alliance that would...
That's crazy because over the next century, from that statement by Roosevelt, that would literally flip. And you can imagine, like, the assertion of, like, the need to defend two oceans, the Panama Canal becomes so important because of that.
secure Anglo-American interests. There was, of course, little wish for a formal alliance in either of the two countries. Even so, by 1914, Anglo-American relations were better than in any period since the Revolution. British possessions in the New World were secure, and capital from the City of London remained dominant in South America. But it was clear that in the Latin world and the Caribbean, the United States had become the hegemon. The contest over who would dominate the Americas was over. 1914 would bring about the start of a new competition for control of the world.
Yeah, World War One, and yet so much stuff happening there. This is interesting, you know. I love these videos because it really tells us the story, the political story, and the back channels and the conversations and the spectrum of policy and where that entails, where, you know, who entails where, and what countries are involved, what countries are staying on the sidelines, and so forth. Obviously, you have a very, like, you have a heightened U.S. now with imperial ambition that we don't really know where that's going to go, especially in the 1910s. You have a Europe that's on the brink of collapse of war. We know that, with nationalism and innovation and alliances and all the other stuff. But in terms of Britain here and the relationship with the United States, it seems like just through time alone and just pragmatic conversation, it has, like, evolved. It's evolved in such a way to where they are on stable ground, and there's not really a need. There is not a fight to be had because there isn't a resource or a particular piece of land or a piece of idealism that is threatened per se. You had that in the Civil War, a destabilized U.S., a blockade, an economic like blockade, and so forth. You had it then, but since the years have passed, with the production in the United States has boomed, you really become a partnership. Really fun story that we are unwinding here. I think there's like 5 or 6 parts to this, so I can't wait to do the others. Appreciate you guys as always. Consider subscribe. I can't talk. Consider subscribing, and maybe I can talk. Peace out, guys. Bye bye.